Welcome to the 𝙒𝙧𝙖𝙧𝙗 podcast. I'm Rami, and in this episode, I'll be speaking with Simranjeet, who's a trainee at Womblebond Dickinson. So Simranjeet, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well. So just to get sort of knuckled down into this, so you're a trainee solicitor, so you've had experience researching firms' main practice areas and choosing seats for your own training contract. So before we delve into specific practice areas and what they mean, what advice would you have for aspiring lawyers who may not know sort of which practice areas they're interested in, which obviously has an impact on the firms that they apply to in the end?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. I guess the first thing is figuring out whether you want to go into commercial law or whether you want to work in high street firms. The latter, you're helping private individuals in matters like divorce, like family law, like wills, whereas commercial law is obviously lawyers helping clients in the day-to-day running of their business. And that could involve things like buying another company. It can involve purchasing some real estate for that client. It can involve aiding in a copyright claim. So I've worked in both high street and commercial, and I found the former really personal. I found it really kind of emotionally draining, whereas I liked the hustle and bustle of working in London. The kind of commercial law route seemed a lot more diverse, and it seemed to appeal to my skill set a lot more. So what I would say is, first of all, is try and put yourself out there. And I know that's easier said than done, but even things like attending webinars when they're talking about particular practice areas, say if a certain law firm is providing a bit of a briefing about what insolvency law is about or what family law is about, then attending those webinars and really looking at your own skill set and thinking, is this something that appeals to me personally or does it not? And I think it's also okay to have an open mind. People ask me all the time, Sim, what do you want to specialize in? And I have no idea yet. And I'm keeping very much an open mind. And that is actually what is recommended as well, because the last thing you want on a training contract is to put all your eggs in one basket. Say you want a corporate seat and then you don't get that seat. And then when it comes to NQ roles, you're trying to persuade that firm to take you on for something that's not a corporate seat, for example. So it can actually end up shooting you in the foot if you narrow yourself too much in the process. And it's also important to recognize that your opinion does keep changing as you progress as well. At law, when I was at law school, when I was studying law at undergraduate, I hated insolvency law. I found it so boring. And then when I was a paralegal, I absolutely loved it. So what you learn and what you do in practice can completely change. And I'm really kind of looking out for the fact that my opinions, for example, I really love IP at the moment and I really love real estate, but I'm open to those opinions changing now that I'm going into practice. So I think that's my main kind of piece of advice. I'd say try not to get too bogged down by the fact that, oh my God, I don't know what I want to go into. As long as you have in my opinion, an overall interest in commercial law or high street law firms and what their practice areas are like, then I think that's the way forward.
Yeah, so the sense I gain from that is that it's a good idea to maybe learn about different practice areas, to maybe have a few that you're interested in, but don't sort of get dead set on maybe one practice area. And then, for example, if you don't get it, during your training contract, you're going to be very disappointed. So learn about practice areas, but keep an open mind with regard to, where you want to end up in the future. Because obviously, as you touched upon, you may study something in university that you hate, but then you actually end up enjoying it in your training contract.
Yeah, 100%.
Excellent. So we're just going to touch on a few of the major practice areas, what they mean, and the typical tasks that trainees might do in these practice areas. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. You could go on for hours discussing these, but I think this is a good place to start. So let's start with corporate and M&A. So what would a trainee solicitor typically do in this sort of department?
This is a really kind of popular seat option and also a really popular elective. When you're in a trainee in this team, a lot of it just generally as well in other seats as well, but a lot of the things that you'll be doing is a lot of drafting work, is a lot of communicating between the parties, but you could be the person who's drafting the correspondence and then giving it to your supervisor to then pass on to the client. It depends on your team and, their kind of standing on whether you would have direct communication with the client yourself. In terms of what corporate and M&A is even, I guess, really about, if I was to really summarize it, it is the buying and selling of shares or assets in a company. You could get involved in that aspect. You can get involved with incorporating a company, so starting a company off. You could even be involved with listing clients on the stock exchange. So all those different elements come in, get involved into the corporate process. So of course, some of the roles that a trainee solicitor would be doing, like I've mentioned, is drafting things like share purchase agreements, loads of other documentation and contracts with other third parties. So there's a lot of reviewing involved, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of attention to detail skills that would be required when you are reviewing these contracts, because they all may look the same, but there may be little differences here and there, or different clauses that you need to put in. So it's that attention to detail that's really required in these seats. I would also say you will also be involved a lot of the time with document reviews and due diligence. I had to do a doc review, and that involved analyzing 32,000 emails in 2 weeks. So really don't underestimate how many documents you could get in a doc review. That is one of the kind of tasks that's notoriously given to trainees because no one else wants to do it. And it is really kind of long. So really do prepare for that element as well. But it is such an important element, because if that due diligence picks up something, if you pick up something in your document review that isn't aligning to what's been communicated, or is a kind of a bit of a red flag essentially, then that could really kind of impact the way the parties move going forward. So it is a really essential part of the process. And it's not to say that, of course, everyone doesn't want to do that kind of much analyzing of documents, but it is a vital part of the process. And you could also get involved with kind of board meetings and getting approval for board meetings and stuff. If you are interested in this area of law, I think if you study business law, that's a core module on the LPC, but also M&A as an elective on the LPC, that would really help you out. And also in respect of the listing on stock markets, there's been a lot of news stories about that recently in terms of Bumble and Deliveroo. They're both of their IPOs. The corporate teams in law firms were definitely involved in that aspect. And it may even be worth comparing and contrasting the different IPOs there as well. But I think that goes beyond the question. So if you are interested in corporate, definitely investigate those cases as well, if that's something that you are genuinely interested in.
Excellent. So the sense again from that is corporate and M&A is all about business deals and how businesses function, and really all the legal and sort of business components of that is what you can expect to get involved in as a trainee. But moving on to banking and finance, what would you sort of summarize banking and finance as consisting of, and some of the tasks you might complete in the seat?
Yeah, sure. So banking and finance is essentially just the relationship between lenders and borrowers. And the thing with banking and finance, it is a very kind of umbrella term, in my opinion. When I've had experience with different firms and I've gone to different events, they all have different kind of subgroups or sub names for these areas. And they include they might have kind of one team, for example, that deals with standard just bank loans that you can get, the normal ones that we kind of come across every day. And there might be a team that's involved with mortgages. And then you get to things like derivatives and capital markets. So all those key terms that you hear and you have no idea what that's about. So those elements do come in terms of banking and finance as well. In terms of derivatives, I think that deals with managing currency rates during a transaction. So for example, if a transaction is multi-jurisdictional, that's where the derivatives team get involved, because they are involved with managing and placing bets on the different currency rates. In terms of what the trainee solicitors do in banking and finance teams, again, it's a lot of negotiating. Perhaps they can get involved in negotiating terms of the lending agreements. You could get given a copy of the lending agreement and just run through it and see whether it matches the client's ideals or not. Are there any particular clauses that need negotiating or need flagging up? Again, you'll probably be conducting due diligence, because you don't want to be entering into an arrangement with another party when, for example, they could be in some kind of financial difficulties. And also you could get involved in structuring the agreement as well and the arrangement. So for example, like I said, if there are particular clauses or particular things that the client wants in place in those agreements, then you would be in charge of that element as well.
Excellent. So whereas corporate will be mainly about business and business transactions, for example, banking finance is more about access to finance and, helping borrowers and lenders, in those transactions as well. But a department which may sort of seem quite similar to banking and finance is capital markets. So how would you sort of summarize what capital markets actually is, and maybe the difference between that and banking and finance?
Yeah, sure. So I do think capital markets is sometimes placed as a subgroup within banking and finance. And what I tend to think about when I think of banking, when I think of, sorry, capital markets, is kind of like Dragon's Den. So there's a business that needs cash, or they need some kind of capital that needs raising. And the investors on the other end, they're looking to invest in companies, they're looking to build their portfolio. And that's where capital markets come in. So capital markets is that kind of arena or area which allows a business that needs that cash injection and an investor to interact. And there are different types of capital markets that there are available. This is where, when I was doing my research, when I was back in the day, I used to get really confused about this element. But for example, there are two types. You can get equity capital markets. So those are things like when businesses go public and they are offering themselves to the world stock markets, just like we talked about with Bumble and Deliveroo. And then you also get debt capital markets. So that's in terms of borrowing to raise money. And they also do things like selling debt obligations to investors. And that kind of goes into a whole other realm of bonds and all those kind of fancy words, which I'm sure you guys can really kind of research as well. I think there is a really good page. I think Chambers Student, they have a really cool section dedicated on the website where they get lawyers come in and they explain what they do in layman's terms. And I really recommend Googling that and finding that out. In terms of a solicitor's role in these teams, again, very similar to, I guess, banking and finance teams, drafting documents, negotiating contracts, but also, I guess, looking at the regulatory changes, any legal changes in the legal framework, and providing advice in that respect as well.
Excellent. And one that which is kind of different from the last two that we've spoken about is real estate. So what would a real estate lawyer do? And what is this sort of area of law that you might sit in as a trainee?
Real estate is one of my favorites. I'm not going to lie. It might be one that I qualify in the future. Who knows? But it's essentially, there's different elements of real estate as well. Some teams have massive real estate teams. And I think, for example, CMS is one of those firms that has a massive real estate team where they have loads of different subgroups. One element of that is just simple conveyancing. Conveyancing is just a really kind of traditional term for buying and selling the properties. And that there's also kind of elements in real estate involved in terms of tenancies and leasing and that kind of element. And also other sub teams are things like planning. You can get residential teams. So that's purely involved with buying and selling of residential property. You can also get commercial real estate teams. So that's involved with the big purchasing of hotels and leisure clubs and all of that big stuff. And you can also get property litigation as well. So I don't know, say if someone had a dispute over something that happened with the property, I don't know, the staircase wasn't fitted properly or whatever, that element, that's where property litigation comes in. Currently in my training contract, I am in the construction disputes team. Construction is a very kind of different area of law compared to real estate. I thought at first it would be something that was underneath that real estate umbrella. And in some respects it is, but because I'm in the construction disputes team, that actually comes more under dispute resolution than real estate. So there is a lot of kind of overlap as well between different practice areas. So just because you are within one area doesn't mean it becomes, just because you're in construction doesn't mean you're in real estate. You could also be having overlaps with other business groups as well. And in terms of what solicitors and trainees do in real estate teams, I had to do this as a paralegal as well, but looking at leases, picking out key clauses or key terms that didn't match our client. You'd also do a lot of researching in terms of finding title registers and property information. Who owns the property? Is it freehold? Is it leasehold? Are there any easements or charges on the property? So a lot of research in that kind of element as well. And you'd also, I think a big thing about being a real estate trainee is getting used to the land registry system, because you will be on that website a lot. You'll be drafting relevant forms like TR1s or all these kind of fancy names, RX4s, that all mean different things, but all these different kind of legal relevant forms for what your client wants to do. You'll be drafting them, sending them out to the land registry. And you're also involved in that aspect of when you are, for example, buying and selling a property, there's different stages involved in the process. One of those stages, for example, is exchange, where the contracts are exchanged. Then there's completion, when the whole kind of thing is obviously, I guess, completed. And also post-completion matters, for example, paying stamp duty, redeeming the mortgage. So all those different elements you are also a part of as well. And I think one reason why I really like real estate, especially the buying and selling side, is that procedure element, or the fact that you can see stage by stage where you are progressing with the client, which is quite nice in terms of providing a structure.
Yeah, and of course, at the end of it, you may actually get to see some of the properties that you were involved with. So I guess that's quite exciting if you're sitting in real estate. So moving on from real estate, we've got pensions and employment, and I'm aware there are different names that you may sort of have this under, but the wider employment, pensions, and those sorts of areas. What does that actually encompass within a training contract, for example, and what are the tasks that you may actually work on?
So from what I'm aware with employment and pensions, I guess this is the area I know the least about, if I'm honest with you. When it comes to employment, I guess with that element, you can represent either the employer or the employee. For example, with employees, it could be about their rights. For example, the way they've been made redundant, for example, could be something that they raise with you. There could be indirect discrimination, direct discrimination claims. For example, they just want to seek your advice on a particular incident that happened in the workplace that could potentially affect them legally. And then from an employer's perspective, you could be kind of defending your employer or your client in a claim that's been brought against an employee. You could also be providing advice on policies, on remuneration, like different HR policies, for example. And you could be negotiating with employees on the employer's behalf. So in terms of the role that the trainee has here, there's a lot of, in my opinion, from what I've heard from just kind of rumors, I guess what I've heard on the grapevine is there is that kind of client involvement involved, because you do get to go to those interviews and you do get to kind of hear from the employees or the employer. There's also some involvement with trade unions and stuff as well. I think there is a lot of kind of advisory element, because you are also reviewing these employer contracts, you're making sure they're up to date. You are providing letters of advice to clients based on certain events that have happened. So it's really kind of wide ranging. I think this element is more kind of what I've heard is the more drafting element, and a more kind of reviewing contracts, reviewing your policies, that element as well. In terms of pension, this is an area where I don't know whether you're the same, but when I hear the terms in pensions or tax or anything, it just goes straight over the top of my head. And I think that for me literally says I do not want to be in that practice, kind of that area of practice. And I guess the clue with pensions is in the name, I guess. From what I know of it, I know very little, I guess, is that lawyers are basically advising in the creation or the structuring or the funding of pension schemes. And the reason why I feel like pensions is linked within that employment law umbrella is because obviously employers have their own pension funds. They have their own favorite providers that they use for pension schemes. And of course, solicitors are there advising their clients or their clients who are employers on what pension funds they should use and what providers they should use.
And one that you touched upon earlier is litigation and disputes resolution. So what work could you actually do in this area, and what does it encompass within a training contract?
I feel like litigation teams present themselves in several different areas of law. So you can get the standard commercial disputes team. So any kind of dispute that arises in the day-to-day running of a business. And for example, for me, I'm in construction disputes, which is a completely kind of different subgroup within dispute resolution. And like I've mentioned as well, you can get employment litigation, you can get banking litigation, you can get property litigation teams. And I guess from my kind of general understanding of litigation and disputes resolution, unlike what the name says, litigation, we are actually trying to not let our clients go to litigation and actually settle and resolve the dispute beforehand, hence the name dispute resolution. Because the litigation process is so expensive and really costly and timely as well, we want to try and ensure our clients reach a settlement beforehand that doesn't lead to reputational damage and all of that element. So having an understanding of things like different types of ADR, so alternative dispute resolution, is really important. In construction, for example, we have a specific form of ADR called adjudication, which is something that I didn't know about on the LPC at all, but it's really cool how there are different types of ways out there to resolve disputes. And some of the roles that a lawyer would be doing here typically, and by lawyer I mean solicitor or trainee, is negotiating with the other party, communicating with the other side's lawyers. And of course, again, dispute resolution is a very kind of step-by-step process. So you have the pre-action stage, which is the stage where you're supposed to actually try and settle, try and come to some kind of agreement without having to go to court. And then say if you have to claim and you have to bring a claim to court, then obviously there's a letter of claim, there's a particulars of claim, there's a defense and the response to defense and all that kind of malarkey that comes on afterwards. And then of course, when it comes to settlement, for example, say if the parties do decide to settle, you will probably be involved in a trainee in terms of drafting the settlement agreement or reviewing the other side's settlement and just trying to negotiate those terms and coming to the best solution for your client. And yeah, I think that's what I'd basically say in terms of a really fast introduction into that practice area.
Yeah, so that sort of raises an interesting point that, when you think of litigation and disputes resolution, you might think of like two big companies fighting it out in court and then the lawyers poring over all these documents. But actually often in times, as you suggested, it may be about avoiding court action because, the bad press and the cost of that. So, working to avoid court action and solving your disputes and other methods. So I think that is an interesting point that maybe a lot of people sort of overlook. So thank you for raising that. And so we've covered 6 practice areas: corporate and M&A, banking and finance, capital markets, real estate, employment pensions, and litigation and disputes resolution. Of course, there are many other practice areas. And actually, Simranjeet, you've actually made a YouTube video where you discuss, a lot of these practice areas. So I'll link this below if you want to learn more about different practice areas, particularly those that we haven't covered. But we've reached the end of the podcast episode. So thank you for featuring.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I had so much fun.
Excellent. Well, it was great to speak to you and have a great day.